So when we came up with the theme of this conference, and it was rediscovery with dis in brackets, we knew that we were saying that part of how we recover is by remembering how we did it before. I don't know if we knew at that time that there was a book called Sacred Civics, Building Seven Generation Cities. Maybe we did. Fortuitously, it came together that with our theme, we were able to encourage the authors of the book to join us, and they will be our first panel. Before I welcome Jayne, who is the moderator, to speak and then introduce the rest of the panel, we wanted to let you know that we've purchased a copy of the book, and we're going to be putting it in the library so that people have access to it and can borrow it. And I think that there is also an e-version of the book. And for anybody who has not yet discovered Halifax Public Library is on Libby, it will change your life. So without further ado, I pass it over to Jayne Engle.
Thank you so much for that, Louise, and what a gift. That's very kind of you. I'm so glad that it will be in the library there. I love the Halifax Central Library, so greetings to all of you who are there. And also, just so you know, it is also free open access online to anyone who wants to read it. So we wanted to make it available everywhere. So good morning to those of you in Halifax and Chipuktuk and everyone who's tuning in virtually. Good afternoon to some of our guests who are calling in from Europe. And wherever in the world you may be, hello. And I'd like to first thank you. Thank you, Louise, TJ, Olivia, the other organizers of this year and of past years. I too love this conference every year and have always been very, very happy and grateful to take part. So thanks for being here, and thanks to each of the panelists. I'm so excited to introduce them in a few minutes after I say a few words about the book and the context for the book. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from a city that's on unceded territory, unceded island, which is known as Tiohtià:ke in its original language of the Mohawk peoples, who, along with other indigenous peoples, they stewarded the lands and waters here for thousands of years. This place is also called Montreal, and I'm very grateful to be here. I also, like Kathy, I want to acknowledge that this is a day of mourning. It's a day of mixed mourning, I'd say, though. So officially in Canada, the UK, and some other places, it's a day of mourning the passing of Queen Elizabeth. I also want to recognize it as a day to mourn colonialism and its many manifestations, especially those over the past centuries. A lot of the book, Sacred Civics, has to do with how we can decolonize our systems and practices and mindsets and continually understand what that means and bring that into being. And so that means interrogating so much of our practices of city building. And another one of the manifestations that I just want to acknowledge, because it was something prepared for this conference, is the doctrine of discovery. So regarding the doctrine and its implications, if you haven't already seen it, I'd invite you to read a beautiful reflection which was prepared for the occasion of this conference by Elder Pauline Helistis Waterfall of the Heiltsuk First Nation. It's a beautiful piece, it's deeply personal, it's incredibly moving, and it's very important. And I thank both Elder Helistis and also Tanya Chongtiam-Phuc, who was her friend and supported her in preparing the reflection. And I also want to mention, it's also a day of mourning for Tanya. Tanya Chongtiam-Phuc would be here with us on this panel, but a loved one of hers over the weekend made a journey into the next world. And so she is mourning today. So yes, a moment for mixed mourning indeed. And I'd also like to put the framing for this in the context of the broader moment that we are living in the world, and recognize that it's a historically novel moment, where it's a time of both existential risk and crisis, and it's also a time for deep hope and for building together better futures. And that's very much what Sacred Civics is about. So I'll say a few words. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read Sacred Civics yet, I'll share with you a little bit about the thesis of the book and why we did it, some of what it's about. And then I'll be very happy to introduce the speakers who are here. And this will be a very conversational panel. So I'll invite each of them to speak to their contributions, and then we'll have a conversation together about it. So the thesis of the book is threefold. So it's first that cities matter, recognizing cities as the largest human construct. Cities are complex, they're systems of systems, they tend to endure, and of course the majority of the world's people live in cities. So societal transition has to happen in cities, and to recognize that. Second is that everything is connected and interdependent. So it's important to think holistically, not only in terms of getting out of our silos and sort of single point solutions to problems, but also in the sense of holism and recognizing spiritual dimension of people and place and what that can bring. And then the third is that we do have capabilities to transcend, that is to rise above the current trajectories and build vastly better futures. And we lay out what that means in terms of higher order responsibilities and accountabilities, including to future generations, where the 7-generation cities comes from, to the health of the planet. That involves questioning assumptions, some of our basic assumptions from property and ownership to how we build our housing and so on. And not least, it invites us to value differently. And we'll talk about that in our discussion. So interrogating the logics of our civic economies and cultivating the collective wisdom to do that well and justly, which of course is no small order. So importantly, the book is really an invitation to reimagine. It recognizes the vast challenges of today, what's sometimes called the poly crisis or the meta crisis, from polarization and social unrest. We know that there are wars happening in different parts of the world. We know about energy crises, climate, inequality rising, pandemics, housing, cost of living. There's no shortage of existential risk. So we're not putting those to the side. We're facing those head on, and also inviting us to elevate our expectations about what is possible to move forward. So we imagine shaping cities as if people, land, and nature were sacred, and how that involves developing responses in our city building that are commensurate with the existential risks that we face. So a quick word about sacred and spirituality, just to be clear. We're not talking about religion per se in that. We mean, by sacred, we mean the inherent worth and dignity of all beings. We recognize spiritual dimension as a sense of shared purpose and meaning, a sense of connection between people and with nature, and how deeply that matters. And it's also very much about recognizing and centering Indigenous knowledges and worldviews to inform city futures, from governance systems that recognize rights of nature and rights of future generations to legal systems that consider law as a verb, which means a responsibility to law together and continually change laws that evolve as the world changes. We have so much to learn from Indigenous traditions and systems. So contributors, some of the contributors to Sacred Civics are here with us today, and we come from different backgrounds, traditions, geographies, and we share a commitment to different ways of thinking and building cities for the long term. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists first, and then after I introduce them all, we'll do a round to give each of them an opportunity to share something about their contributions, to each take a few minutes before we enter into some discussion. So Pam Glode-Desrochers is with us. She is Executive Director of the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center there in Chipuktuk, Halifax, where she's been for 30 years. Pam is Mi'kmaqi. She's a Lanu woman and member of the Millbrook First Nation community. She's won awards for outstanding leadership and serves on national boards, including the National Housing Council, and she's vice president of the National Association of Friendship Centers. Hello, Pam. Jennie Stephens has a recent book called Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership, which inspires collective action by elevating the stories of innovative, diverse leaders linking climate and energy with economic justice, health and food, transportation and housing. She's a professor of sustainability science and policy at Northeastern University in Boston, but I think joining us today from Dublin. So hello, Jennie. Kofi Boone is professor at NC State University, and he works in the overlap between landscape architecture and environmental justice, especially on democratic design and cultural landscapes. He's won awards for his teaching. He's founder of the Just Communities Lab, and he's on several boards, including the Black Landscape Architects Network, and he's originally from Detroit. Hello, Kofi. Indy Johar is an architect and founder of Dark Matter Labs, who are building the boring revolution, which means creating institutions, instruments, infrastructures for more equitable and caring futures. He's co-founded a number of social ventures, and he's a leader in civic economies, in urban infrastructure finance, and in governance design. And he was recently awarded the Design Innovation Medal by the London Design Festival. Congratulations, Indy. And not least, Jonathan LaPalme, who is co-director of Dark Matter Labs. He's based in Montreal, and he's also co-founder of a number of social enterprises. One initiative, which is really taking off right now, is called Nouveau Voisin, which aims to transform the culture of lawns and reimagine our own backyards as places of biodiversity with plants, pollinators, birds, and other wildlife. So Jonathan is, he's also a strategic designer, a writer, curator, and documentary filmmaker. Bienvenue, Jonathan. All right, and as I mentioned, Tanya is not with us today, but I will be channeling her a little bit in some of my interventions. Tanya is co-director with me of Participatory Canada, and also co-editor and co-author of Sacred Civics. She's also director of research for the Centre for Indigenous Innovation and Technology, associate of Evergreen and Future Cities Canada. She's of Akawayu, Indigenous, and mixed ancestry from Guyana and the Netherlands, and she's a world bridger of Indigenous and Western cultures and paradigms. Okay, so sorry, that's a lot from me already. So I'd like to move into our discussion, and we'll have a round of hearing a few minutes, 3 to 5 minutes or so from each panelist, following my questions, and then we'll have discussion between us. Then we'd like to take some questions from the audience. So please do, if you're tuning in online, please put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. And I assume that Louise and organizers have a way to gather questions from the live audience and also make those apparent to us. And then we'll close. And so let's begin. And I'm really excited to hear people's bold thinking and suggestions for big moves that we can make that are commensurate for this time. So Pam, I am going to start with you. You and I met over 3 years ago, and we were discussing your vision for the proposed new Mi'kmaq Friendship Center, what truth and reconciliation means in an urban context, and whether the participatory city approach of all things might be adapted as a way to center Indigenous knowledges and experiences in ways that would be inclusive of everyone. So you built some vision around that, and I'd love to hear what your vision is for the new Friendship Center, and a little bit about the journey of the past couple of years creating Everyone Every Day Chipuktuk.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. I just want to acknowledge Tanya's loss. Please send her my regards, and it's never easy when somebody passes on to their next journey. But in saying that, I know I only have a few minutes. I do not prepare notes ever. I do speak from the heart. That is a very traditional way of storytelling. And to me, this is about a storytelling opportunity for us to talk about the Friendship Center and how our journey came to be. Of course, I have been with the Friendship Center for 30 years, and we have been doing engagement with non-Indigenous folks forever. When time came that we were looking at a new building, and these are some of the newest designs, and you guys are probably one of the first to begin to see these, by the way. It was really important that we remain connected to our communities and our community members across Nova Scotia and in the Atlantic provinces. But it wasn't about bricks and mortar. It was about so much more. We were looking for a way to actually enhance what we do and how we offer and bring space to people. We were looking at a way that we could continue doing our reconciliation with people, but have a real building that is more than just bricks and mortar. It's about having soul and purpose. And so we went on a long journey. We took a whole team to some elders down in Escazone. We spent the day there doing traditional ceremony in sweats. And the participatory city piece really fell quite accidentally. I had been in Ottawa promoting the new Friendship Center and why it was important to invest differently in social infrastructure. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do a presentation to McConnell Foundation where Jayne was working. And lo and behold, Jayne started talking about something that just triggered who and what I am. It was about bringing people together, and it was about actually bringing us in a space that we could have tough conversations, but also looking at ways for the future, for 7-generational planning. And I'm very blessed to be doing what I do. I'm privileged to be doing the work that I do. I work for my community. And I'm happy to say that Participatory Canada is actually very much based on a traditional way of teaching. If you remove all, and by the way, everybody, I am not an academic by any means. I am a true grassroots person. I am for my community, by my community. And this approach really triggered a real opportunity for us to learn from each other, and not just Indigenous folks. We have been marginalized in urban settings. Right now, probably 80% of Indigenous people are working, living, and playing in the urban context. And I want to ensure that we remain a part of the system. And when I say part of the system, I'm talking about making challenges to existing systems to actually look at traditional ways of being. I want us to not just think about placemaking, because the places are there, and yes, we're adapting and changing, but it's also important for us to have a space like the Friendship Center to actually ensure that we maintain our connection, that we are not just inviting in non-Indigenous people into our space to be comfortable, but actually looking at ways to bring in our connection to land, water, sea, animals, whatever that may be in an urban context. And how do we do that? And how do we actually connect in different ways? And Participatory Canada, I do believe, based on truth and reconciliation, we can adapt and change how we actually intertwine with each other, how we work together, how we think together. I have been with the Friendship Center for 30 years. And I, again, very privileged to be doing what I do. But I also recognize that there is very little connection outside of our center with the broader community. And I want to break that barrier down. I want us to change and shift. And then you begin to recognize how much people haven't come into our space, haven't been engaging with us. So we want to shift and change how we actually do that work. I've always said, you know, the Friendship Center is about a building. Absolutely. It is about bricks and mortar. But it's so much more. I see it as a living, breathing ecosystem that can actually allow us to do and think differently. I'm one of those people that actually like to try and challenge people. I'm not always the biggest fan in the group when there's a bunch of developers. I actually believe we should be looking at lands differently as well. We shouldn't own lands. You know, at the end of the day, we don't, you know, somebody made up an imaginary system that has drew some lines and said, you own this, you own this, and you own this. When the reality is, at the end of the day, that land will be there. And we are supposed to be looking after those spaces. We are supposed to be, as Indigenous people, and I think all people, we are responsible for how we treat things and how we work together and how we move together. And that land will be there hopefully long after I've gone and moved on. But we should be looking at not just social infrastructure differently, but lands and how we use it and how we ensure that it's there for the next 7 generations. And Jayne, you're gonna have to remind me how close I am to my 5 minutes, or because I can, you know me, I can continue to talk, by the way. But it is important for us to look at things differently, challenge ourselves and how we think. You know, a lot of Indigenous people don't even realize that they can actually own homes. And that is based on systems that have been put in place to actually marginalize us. So we are really challenging everybody. And that includes Indigenous people who only have known the Indian Act their entire life. So we begin to challenge people a little differently with the new Friendship Center. And that's the work that I want to continue to see happen. And I believe that, you know, Participatory Canada, we can shift and change how we do things. I think we can find a better way to do things. I think there's a way that we are actually enhancing our urban context, but also allowing us to do things differently that welcome back in traditional knowledge. And I think, you know, that's one of the biggest pieces for me. You know, it is about doing things differently, and it is about thinking differently. And that's scary. Change is scary, but what's even scarier to me is no change at all. So Jayne, I'll leave it at that, because like I said, I can continue to talk all day long about these things.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all that, Pam. And we will come back to some of the themes that you mentioned, not least the notion of land ownership that will be in a later intervention from one of the group. But that's beautiful. And I should mention that Pam and Tessie Britton and I documented this work, and also the reason for it and kind of the vision behind it in one of the chapters of the book. And speaking of chapters of the book, I'd like to turn now to Jennie. And Jennie wrote a chapter of the book which is called Feminist Anti-Racist Values for Climate Justice, Moving Beyond Climate Isolationism. So Jennie, I wonder if you can share with us a little bit, you know, what do you mean by climate isolationism? You also talk about something called energy democracy as a pathway in your chapter, and it would be great to hear more about those concepts and why they matter particularly now, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Jayne. And it's great to be here and being able to virtually contribute to the discussion this morning. I'm zooming in from Ireland, where I am spending time in Dublin on my sabbatical. And Ireland is a place where there's a long legacy of suffering from colonialism. So just acknowledging that and where I'm zooming in from. And I want to, my own experience, and I've been trained as a kind of environmental scientist. And so a lot of my training and learning was about the science of climate change, and then the technologies that are being put forth to quote unquote solve the climate crisis. And throughout my 25 years thinking about climate change and being engaged with this emerging urgent crisis of change that we're all experiencing around the world, everyone is in different ways, I began to recognize the inadequacy of how we talk about climate change, how policies and practices, how we're conceptualizing the climate crisis. And I come up with this framing of climate isolationism as this narrow, technocratic, male-dominated kind of controlling way of thinking about the crisis that is completely inadequate. It's quite a dangerous way of thinking about it because it isolates it as something separate from everything else. And so in my work more recently, I'm working on reframing, kind of working toward climate justice and social justice and focusing on social changes, social justice, social innovation, which we seem to, in a lot of the climate discussions, kind of leave off the table, really, when we talk so much about technological innovation and particularly with energy system change. And so what I see is that it's really the polluter elite, or those who are profiting from continued extraction and exploitation of fossil fuels, that have really been resisting some of these other ways of thinking about it and actually promoting this climate narrow way of thinking about decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reductions, and which is all necessary. But we need to broaden our rediscover and reimagine what it means. And the climate change is a symptom, not the problem itself, right? Like it, and we need to reframe that so that we can leverage the urgency of the climate crisis, because things are changing so quickly that there is an urgency there, and we need to leverage that for deeper systemic structural change about how we organize society and how we redistribute and reallocate power. And that's where my framing of feminist, anti-racist perspectives and values comes in. And it really means paying attention to power dynamics constantly. Who's being included, who's being excluded, who's advantaged by a certain policy or practice, and who's being disadvantaged. And we have so many structural challenges that we need a bigger transformative lens to resist at all kinds of scales these policies, practices, and structures that are making all of the problems worse. So, but there's so many people and organizations and communities and collective action coming together by and connecting in solidarity the challenges we have and the opportunities we have for change. And so I stay optimistic through these collective actions that are possible, and so many inspiring people and organizations thinking differently. And I know when we look at the political scene, it doesn't always look that optimistic, but there's so much more going on that I remain optimistic. And the one other concept that I want to mention here is energy democracy, which is an idea about really leveraging, if we acknowledge we need to move away from extractive, exploitative fossil fuels toward more regenerative, renewable-based future that is more healthy, we can envision redistributing power, literally and figuratively, right? Like the actual power itself, and we can have locally generated, regionally appropriate mix of renewable generation for energy. But we can also see how making that move actually will redistribute economic power, political power, and these other cultural forms of power as well. So that's what the energy democracy movement is all about. And it's really about resisting the status quo, reclaiming and then restructuring energy systems as one very tangible way we can dismantle and disrupt the status quo. So thank you and I'll stop there and looking forward to hearing from the others. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Jennie. I'd really love to dive in a little bit more to energy democracy and possibilities there. So would love to, especially in this country, which is this country that I'm calling in from, where fossil fuels and extractive industries are such a huge part of the economy, super important. But of course, for us everywhere. So thanks for that. Kofi, I'd like to turn to you. So you and Julian Agyemang wrote a chapter in the book called The Black Commons, a framework for recognition, reconciliation, and reparations. I'd love if you could share with us what is the Black Commons? What does that mean? Where did it come from? What's the vision and possibility there? Over to you.
Happy to. Thank you, Jayne. And thank you, everyone. And also thank you to my co-author and one of the co-editors of the book, Julian Agyemang at Tufts University in the United States, for whom I probably wouldn't be here if he hadn't reached out in partnership. The chapter comes from an article that we wrote early in 2020 as we were observing and participating in the uprisings that were happening all over the world. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in the United States in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the focus on, at that time in media, really resistance and abolitionist movements dealing with policing and criminal justice in our country, which are still relevant conversations that we need to have. But as we started to talk with one another, I teach landscape architecture, Julian teaches urban planning. We started to talk about broader systems of deprivation over sustained periods of time that kind of brought us to this point. And we were concerned that conversation wasn't happening in the broader media. And so we started to do some work and some investigation, building off of research, looking at systems of justice that were sort of self-defined and where they came from culturally, particularly in the Black American experience and particularly in the American South, and started to uncover this really strong thread of communal action, of commons, of collective action as ways to sort of meld the material needs of people under incredible duress, even dating back to the era of colonialism and enslavement, particularly of African people, but also in a contemporary sense, coming out of the era of slavery and dealing with the era of Reconstruction, and even moving into the modern era, and how those stories and that narrative had not really been shared or told, specifically through our disciplinary lenses. And so we sort of engaged on that particular work to recover that story. And that led us to this idea of reparation, which of course was always a major theme since the period of colonialism and enslavement in our country, but really came to a head right after the end of the Civil War in terms of how to repair the harm done, particularly to enslaved African people for centuries of abuse and exploitation, and found that in addition to the material and wealth components, there were issues of spirituality, of settings to perpetuate cultural traditions, of holding on to social structures that were just as relevant and just as valuable. One of the things that we uncovered through the work was the prevalence of, even in the period of enslavement, on plantation grounds, the use of yam grounds and yam fields as places to trade seeds, stories, lots of things that go beyond just material wealth and possessions by enslaved African people, but also ways to perpetuate their cultural traditions, even under that great duress. And so that impetus sort of continues forward, looking into, the era of post-Reconstruction and into, sadly, the Jim Crow era, the great writings of W.B. Du Bois, who wrote specifically about the value of cooperative action, cooperatives as a means of building both economic and political power in Black communities that were sort of franchised across the country. Many places that we really celebrate in the early 20th century in terms of centers of Black wealth and Black land ownership were tied to that. And of course, the huge wave of land dispossession of African Americans, particularly rural lands, where since 1913, particularly with rural land, African Americans and Black people have lost 98% of the land that was once owned by African Americans across the country for various reasons. And so this notion of recognition, right, developing structures that recognize the harm done, was important for us and came out through the article. The idea of reconciliation as a step towards reparations in terms of not just acknowledging the harm, but starting to make redress for those, even in the short term. As examples, we started to talk about in our country how infrastructure was specifically used to destroy burgeoning Black centers of political and economic power. Where I am in Durham, North Carolina, the Hayti community was destroyed by North Carolina Freeway 147 intentionally because it was a place of burgeoning Black community power and a lack of really legal defense. And how, $1 billion, which is not sufficient, of course, but is earmarked in our current infrastructure bill to start to redress those physical infrastructural harms. But then moving beyond that, how reparation may not just be about material wealth, it might be investment in the capabilities of people, investment in helping people to achieve for lifestyles that they want. And so that led us to the idea of the Black Commons, a combination of thinking about the roles of community land trusts and alternative land governance structures that remove sort of the exploitative pressures of real estate, of cooperatives, reclaiming that legacy that was very rich in our communities up until the middle of the 20th century. And then the capabilities approach, the idea that we can also move another step to invest in people so that they can participate fully in the world around us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Kofi. Those are just staggering numbers, because it's both representing, as you said, a loss of 98% of land, but also an invitation to see land differently, alternative land governance, alternative cooperative kind of structure, capabilities, and so on. And I love that that you bring in the notion of the yam grounds and the spiritual and cultural traditions and how important that is. These kinds of everyday expressions of our cultures and our sense of spirit, whatever that might mean. Thanks very much for that. I'd like to turn now to Indy. So you and Fang at Dark Matter Labs, and with the input of Jonathan here and others at Dark Matter Labs, you wrote the last chapter of the book. It's called Radical Civics on Constituting Society. It's a big name. Can you tell us a bit about that? So what do you mean by radical civics? Why is it needed, and what's the potential?
Thank you. Delighted and honored to be on this panel. I suppose that chapter sort of starts to point at a kind of more fundamental transition in our relationship with the world. And I think one of the big things that we have to recognize is that we're probably at the end of a kind of 1 in a 400-year modality of how we related to the world. And as was pointed out by Pam, theories of ownership, whether it's ownership of land or ownership of people, I think all these theories of how we control, orchestrate, subject, object, distance ourselves from the world, separate humanity from the world itself, misunderstand the entanglement. All these things are philosophical, but also social technical philosophical mechanisms which are then passed through our social technical worldview, and they are put in through institutions. They structure how we organize land, they structure how we talk to each other, they structure our theory of investment, they structure the racialization of people, they structure the objectification and subjectification of the difference in their modality. And I think one of the things that's become clear is that we are reaching a moment where that modality of seeing the world no longer functions for many, many reasons. It didn't function historically, but the scale of that unfunctionality is actually self-terminating. And climate change, as was rightly being pointed out, is actually just a symptom of that problem. It's not the problem itself. And what we're starting to see is a kind of a worldview where our externalities are feeding back into us. Our entanglement can no longer be ignored. Our interdependence can no longer be ignored. And that re-emergence of a small world at a planetary scale, I think, is a new it requires a new response. And that response requires us to challenge theories of how we relate to nature, say, for example. Do we see nature as a resource to be extracted in, unpriced, and consumed, or do we see nature as something we cohabit? Who has the right to destroy soil? Who has the right to, who owns the butterflies? These things that are sort of almost slightly metaphysical questions actually become fundamental questions when our biodiverse systems are collapsing at the rate that they are. And we're probably, we're having one of the largest extinction level events ever recorded in the history of the planet, just to sort of put the context into that scale. So radical civics is really starting to say that we need a different framework, and much of our frameworks of public and private actually do not acknowledge the entanglements that we have to live in. And the final point I'd just make, and maybe is, I think one of the big challenges that we face is that it is no longer possible. The climate change is a class of problem that even if Canada, which I think produces as much oil, or has the capacity to produce as much oil as sort of nearly Saudi Arabia, it's extraordinary sort of hydrocarbon capacity. It's not quite there, but it's of that order. When you start to look at that from that lens, even if Canada was to stop producing oil, we would still not make it if Nigeria or if India didn't choose to actually stop being part of a hydrocarbons economy. So we're facing a class of problem that we've never faced before, which is we are planetarily interdependent. And actually that planetary interdependence is of an order of magnitude that's going to require a planetary scale response. And I think that is also going to require a new form of, as people like Sunny Kapoor called, a grand bargain. A grand bargain. So the civics is not just in nations, but civics between nations is going to be fundamental in order to be able to actually make some of this deep transition work. And I think we're not quite yet facing up to the scale of what's coming at us. That's the final point I'd end on, really, is that I think we're massively underestimating what we're about to face. And to not over dramatize it, the current trajectory we're on almost certainly leads us to about 4.1 degrees temperature become vulnerable, where there are 5 major food baskets. They all go vulnerable at about 1.6 to 1.7 degrees temperature. I think so. Already, if you look at end of 2100 rise in sea levels, we're looking at some extraordinary figures on the top end risk charts already. Many coastal cities will be already vulnerable, but if you look at 4.1 degrees, we're in a different ballpark, completely different ballpark of risk. So I don't think we're quite understanding the scale of what we're about to face, which is going to put 1.2 billion people being made vulnerable certainly by the middle of the century, which is not far, by the way. That's about 28, 30 years. So we're talking systemic level vulnerability, and we're going to have to replace our energy sources, 500 billion human units worth of energy resources, which actually, all the hydrocarbon, all the renewables that we've ever built were used up in 1 year of energy increase between 2019 to 2020. Army of change, where everything about us has to change, whether it's energy, food, what we eat, what we consume, our clothes, what we think is value. We have to dematerialize our economy, to change our relationships to our economy. I don't think we're currently talking about the quantum of change we're facing. And I think that change is now coming at us like a tsunami. And the energy crisis that many people are facing, or the food crisis, the inflationary crisis, is just the beginning of a story. And it's going to transform cities at a radical level, and cities are going to have to transform themselves at a radical level if they're going to remain relevant. Some cities are facing 12 degrees temperature rise in the summer. We're talking radical transformation. So I just wanted to put that into context.
Thanks so much for those powerful words, Indy. I think the birds agreed with you. They were singing beautifully as you were speaking, which is quite fitting. So yeah, thanks for of course emphasizing the planetary interdependencies that there are, and the scale of the challenges, and the role of civic systems and interconnected city systems in that. We'll want to come to that some more in the discussion, and especially the kinds of ways that these ideas can manifest in making change, such as through system demonstrators. So we'll come to that following. Great, thank you. And I'd like to turn now to Jonathan. So Jonathan, we have been, you and others at Dark Matter Labs and a number of Indigenous partners, Pam has been part of this journey, Elder Satsan, John Burroughs. We were on a journey for a few years called Civic Indigenous 7.0. It led to a piece, beautiful piece and also body of thinking called Microtreaties with the Earth. And those inquiries were actually quite significant in the motivation that helped lay the ground for sacred civics. So we refer to microtreaties and discuss it both in the opening chapter, the final chapter, and Jonathan was the lead author of that work. So would you please tell us about Microtreaties with the Earth? Explain a bit about how it addresses what could be considered even a quasi-sacralization of property ownership, and why and how why microtreaties matter and how it could manifest. Over to you.
Merci, Jayne. Happy to be here with you live from my apartment in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, which I bought recently. And it was really stressful, a really stressful process in the current housing crisis. And it felt like a very important milestone in my life, even though I'm very critical of it at the same time. And I say that because I feel like it's important to address some of the tensions that exist between the world we inhabit and the one we want to create. And it's key to imagining a future beyond the quasi-sacralization of private property, right? We need to break it down, make it legible, understand what it says in terms of stories and values with the world around us and each other, and then how we might transform it. And so in the piece that was co-written with Marie-Sophie Bonville and the contribution of a lot of other people, we looked at private property and how, under civil and common law, which are both present in Quebec, it is understood as a bundle of rights, including the right to abuse land, right? However, private property is not absolute. It's protected under provincial law. It was excluded from federal constitutional protection, unlike Section 35 of the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal title, which was signed by Queen Elizabeth II, from what I heard yesterday. It already has to interact in many ways with a bundle of responsibilities, right? The municipality in its bylaws, it is telling me what I can and cannot have in my backyard. I don't have a backyard, but if I had one. The province is telling me the kind of renovations I can and cannot make to make it safe for my neighbors and so on. So there's a lot of different layers of rules, responsibilities, rights that tell me certain things about this space that I'm in right now. However, in most of these Western layers, land is absent, silent, passive, dephysicalized. And so one of the questions at the core of Microtreaties with the Earth is how we can restore the voice of land in our legal and contractual mechanisms. It's already the case, as it's already the case with many Indigenous governance systems. We see, Kofi was talking about community land trusts and models that are more plural and relational. And we also have rights of nature emerging right now in many instances. However, it's not really present in urban context, and it has some challenges. And so could it be an opportunity for more legal pluralism in action in cities? And one anecdote that I think embodies that really well, that we've heard from one of the Indigenous colleagues of Jayne at McConnell. There's someone a bureaucrat from the city who came to their place with a ruler to measure the length of his lawn because it was too wild. And there was a complaint by a neighbor. And he did so because the current municipal bylaws are not very biodiversity friendly, because lawn is king right now. And this man evoked the indigenous law from his people on this territory, talking about the relationship with other living beings. And the bureaucrat acknowledged that and left. And I feel like it's an interesting anecdote of how legal plurality at a cultural and at a level of legitimacy is already active. And I wonder how it could be even made more dynamic as we also continue to decolonize some of our own ways. And so some of the questions that I'm left with are, how can buying a property become more about entering into a micro treaty with the earth and a steward of that land? Which regulatory, legal, or cultural layers would need to be transformed in priority in order to get there? And how can we redefine the notion of neighborhood to include other living beings? And what pathways could emerge from a more dynamic intersection between civic and indigenous futures in cities? Merci.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan, and for reminding us about this notion of legal pluralism, right? We don't hear that frequently, or trans-systemic law. There's increasing recognition of indigenous legal systems alongside common and civil legal systems in this country, and I think that needs to become much more prevalent and deep. And thank you for this, because this is one possible manifestation. And I love that this work, it's both very big picture and philosophical, and also quite tangible. If you read the piece that Jonathan co-authored, you'll see that it's brought to bear in very specific ways that it could occur in a city, including Halifax, for example. So maybe we can come to that in a little bit. Okay, so thanks everyone. It's great to have everyone's voice in the room. I'd like to just set a little bit of context for the notion of 7-generation cities, and then to invite some more discussion between us all. And I also want to remind the audience that you're welcome to put questions in the chat or in the room. Louise, if there's a way in the room to gather questions that you could put them in the chat for us to see, that would be wonderful. And we'll turn to questions in in 10 or 15 minutes or so. Okay. All right. So first, the notion of 7-generation cities. So that's the subtitle for the book, and it's really a central question in this work, which is how can we build the physical, digital, social, institutional infrastructures needed so that children 7 generations from now will thrive in just and radically inclusive and caring and regenerative cities. So that's a big question, but we believe that needs to be our aspiration, and that needs to be the kind of lens that we're bringing to how we think about infrastructure. And why 7 generations? So 7 generations is an indigenous teaching. It's in many indigenous traditions. I think it is somewhat different in different traditions. So I don't have the answers. I wouldn't be able to explain all of those, of course, but there are a number of variants. In this case, we're not thinking of it as referring to a specific number of years, but rather seeing it both as a metaphor for committing to intergenerational justice, for committing to long-term futures, for looking centuries into the future, not just years or decades, or actually sometimes even quarters, as we do currently in most Western dominant worldviews. But rather, again, this notion that in any major decision-making process, we would never take decisions without considering very carefully ancestors' experience at least 7 generations into the past, and then looking at least 7 generations into the future and implications for future peoples, future beings, and future ancestors. In our chapter, Awakening 7-Generation Cities, we write about 7 foundational keys and pathways of praxis to bring 7-generation cities into being. Those include relationality, agency, meaning of people and nature, reciprocity, decoloniality, spirituality, responsibility, and what we name, although others have well before us, but pluriversality. And I may take the time later. If Tanya were here, I would invite her to speak to this directly, and especially what reciprocity in particular means in the context of city building imagination and how that draws on Indigenous ways. It has to do with recognizing the gifts of life, for example, that we take for granted. We are all here because of the gifts of nature, including in cities. And what would it mean to be in reciprocity on a daily basis in cities and in a long-term investment way in reciprocity with one another, with other beings, with nature? So that's just an example. And one of the reasons that that I mentioned that example is that as you will have seen, sort of the level of ambition of each one of our friends here, it's very high, and it gets beyond a place where we're a little bit stuck, and that is with small pilot projects, with small experiments in cities, which are important and have been good in many ways, but to respond to the scale of where we are, we actually need to go so much deeper and higher in our aspirations. So deeper and bigger in the scale of the work, and higher in the aspirations. So one name given to this, and Dark Matter Labs and others use this name, is the scale of system demonstrators. So not just pilots, but how can we actually demonstrate how a system could change through a project that can be scaled, and we think that also it can help to do these even in multiple cities at once, if possible, so that there's learning between cities, so that there's growth and evidence building and exploration and discovery together. So I'd like to move a little bit to talk about some system demonstrators, and to invite panelists to talk about potential system demonstrators in this regard with respect to the work that they mentioned. What could be possible? And so I'd love to invite an example of a system demonstrator in a city, either one that exists or one that you imagine, and what it could look like, and even the practicality of how it could be valued and financed, and maybe even financed in quite a different way. And I'm thinking specifically about maybe system demonstrators from Radical Civics. There are a couple in there around food forests. I know you're doing other kinds of system demonstrator work at Dark Matter Labs. Kofi, there are also some examples from the Black Commons, I can imagine, on system demonstrators. But who would like to kick us off? Indy or Kofi, maybe one of you would like to start? And Kofi is coming off mute.
I was gonna defer to Indy, but I'm busted. Tag, I'm it. One note that might be relevant is the actual term, the Black Commons. So although we crafted it, it initially entered the language through the Schumacher Center. And the Schumacher Center is really the organization that codified community land trusts as we know them in the United States now. So there is a legacy of community land trusts in our country that dates back, 100 years and even further. But for groups that are trying to do particularly community land trusts to preserve affordable housing in our country, the template was really set by the Schumacher Center in the 1960s. So sort of a debt of gratitude to them, but they speculated on the idea of a Black Commons that may align with what you're asking, which is imagining a discontinuous set of community land trusts. And their concern was the scale of land control by real estate and private interests, and the inability for small scale discontinuous land trusts to reach a scale where they could actually push back against that broader trend. And so their proposal was to develop a new infrastructure that they called the Black Commons, which dealt with some of the topics that we talked about in the book, but really its central conceit was that it wasn't contiguous land, that people would contribute wherever they are to a broader pool in the interest of building something of scale to push back. And so that idea, I think, is something that we've grappled with, and we've been trying to deal with in terms of its application here, in terms of cooperation between already cooperative entities. But that idea, but in terms of scalable, there's also the attraction of communal land ownership and cooperative ownership in a way is also a way of divesting, sort of abolishing dependency on more corporate real estate practices. And so, at least where we are in the American South, there are an abundance of cooperatives, community land trusts that are really about sort of returning to the land intentionally, not being dependent on fossil fuels, not being dependent on any sort of corporate practices or trade, developing new forms of cooperation and reciprocity with other groups, particularly with farmers, small scale, small shareholder farmers who for many years have been faced with sort of the specter of large agribusiness and the struggle of maintaining sort of their lifestyle and their cultural values and their spiritual values as they deal with the land as well. So, those are two things that come to mind, but I'm happy to defer to Indy.
Okay. Indy, would you like to come in on that?
No, totally happy to. I mean, I think purely from a technical sense, just so we have an idea together, the scale of what we're going to need to do is retrofit whole cities. We're going to have to shift.
Indy,
if we're going to head anywhere near our carbon targets, we're going to have to move from, this is sacrosanct problematic, from petrol vehicles to, Hi, can you hear me?
yes, you're just you're breaking up a bit, Indy. Maybe it might be your video or your location with the birds.
I don't know if that's any better, Jayne. Yeah.
Yes, that's better. Yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. So I was just saying, just to put context, and I'll try to be fast on this, we're talking, the scale of change we're talking about, certainly in a European context, and I think it extends pretty much through the global north. So we're having to retrofit pretty much all of our housing stock. We're going to have to change our mobility patterns from petrol cars to almost certainly some form of electric bikes and electric tricycles. It's not even going to be electric vehicles. We don't have the net materials to be able to afford that. So if you look at the material carbon impacts of that, if you look at actually our food systems, we're going to have to transform whole sections of our food systems, decarbonize them in quite structural senses. We're going to have to look at every part of our electrification of our cities. So the scale of what we're talking about, or nature-based solutions, we're going to have to massively improve the tree canopies of our cities to deal with both flooding and heat island effects. So what we're seeing is super large-scale infrastructure investments are going to come in. Now the question is, and this was raised really brilliantly by Kofi, how do we bring this supersize scale infrastructure level investments in a radically inclusive way, which isn't going to actually do the harmful effects that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where infrastructure was used as a political device rather than a mechanism of genuine systemic empowerment. This is not going to be top-down infrastructure, but emergent infrastructure, micro-massive infrastructure. That's citizen. We're going to have to do this all in a radically democratic way at speed. So the big thing for me is this, just recognizing the scale of the transition. Every house in a city almost certainly having to be retrofitted, changing very deeply and structuring our mobility patterns, changing the quantum of urban, what I would say, so nature-based solutions in our environments, all of this stuff is going to happen. And then food systems, then our material economy, what with the quantum of materials we're going to shift from a material economy to immaterial economy, largely as the nature of what we exchange and what we value. And all of this is structured around, as Pam and other people were saying, and Jonathan was saying, actually a fundamentally different relationship to things. And these system demonstrators are going to have to happen at speed and at scale. And how we do that, I think, is really the big question that's happening, certainly in places like Sweden, of how do you operationalize this stuff at a whole city level? And I think that is an innovation problem at a systemic level, as well as a financial problem, so how we finance the structuring of these investments, and how do you structure them in a way that's deeply inclusive and deeply legitimate in that process. And that, I think, is a scale of challenge that I think we've never done, certainly not in a democratic sense. And I think that's going to be one of the big opportunities and also the necessities of the next few years. And it's not massive, it's not the next 30 years. We're going to have to do this very fast.
Well, thanks. There's our work cut out for us, I would say. Really appreciate that intervention. Before we go to the live audience, we have about a minute. Jennie, Pam, Jonathan, something else to add, or something you'd like to interject at this point?
Yeah, I could just follow up with Indy's point about the scale and connect that with this idea of energy democracy, of the investments that need to be made, big public investment that connects energy with housing and food and transportation and education, and the opportunity. I mean, I just want to connect it very briefly with what we're seeing with the energy crisis. Those communities and households that have already made the big investments in renewables are not going to be suffering as much as those that haven't, right? In the current crisis of fossil fuel scarcity, because renewables are abundant and plentiful energy once the initial investment has been made. So there's a big power there. And I also just want to recognize and honor what's happening this morning in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Fiona. Hit almost exactly 5 years from Hurricane Maria. And once again, Puerto Ricans are without power and looking at underinvestment and the legacy of colonial relationship with the United States, and this complicated opportunity. When after Hurricane Maria hit 5 years ago, there was so much discussion and optimism about, because of the disruption, there could be these big investments, and that this vulnerability would not have to be experienced again. But here we are. So that's a real example of where the vision and the possibility is was clear, but because of all kinds of complicated political and financial constraints, the investments have not been made, and we just need to turn the corner and start making big investments that are needed. So that's an added comment there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennie. Really appreciate that. And sorry to hear about Hurricane Fiona. I know that's already starting to rip through parts of Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean. Important to think of and address that going forward. Okay, Louise, would like to go to you for some questions in the audience. I will make sure Pam and Jonathan, don't worry, you'll have a chance before we go to also intervene again, but I'll turn to you, Louise.
Awesome, thanks. So just if you have a question, just raise your hand. I see one hand up, so someone's going to bring a mic to you.
Hi, my name is Peter Zimmer. I've spent more than 70 years reading science fiction, listening closely to what's said today. And what pops to my mind is the question of what survives when the larger structures appear to fall apart. And when the remnants of those larger structures fight back against the new means. Kofi referred to perhaps an area in the American South where there are lots of small community farms, and visualizing somehow coming together in a new structure. Great. But what of the older Southern landowners fighting back? It's a concern, it's a worry. I would like to be optimistic. I'm not sure I can be.
Before that question gets answered, I just want to ask this one that was in the virtual room because I think it is very related. If I can get my phone on. But the question, Jayne, I saw you were taking some notes. In essence, it's about how does existing space respond when there's new ways of taking up space? The specific question is, can you comment on the effect that more space being made for non-Christian spiritual public practices like smudging or Muslim prayer rooms has had on our public life, especially considering how secular we consider our North American society to be? A third example I want to add to that is actually something that happened right here in HRM, which is with immigration, people have been using some of our public parks differently, where they will have barbecues and have charcoal barbecues, which is common in other parts of the world, but maybe isn't so common here. And how is HRM and the city and its bylaws prepared for that? So just wanted to ask those three together because I think they're kind of related. And then we'll go to Karash's next, but first maybe the answer to this one.
Thanks, Louise. I wonder, in the interest of time, we're very close to time. So I wonder if we could also get that last question and then respond to all the questions at once. And then we'll wrap that in with final comments. So can we hear that last question too?
It's sort of related to the questions that were asked earlier, but a lot of people in the room are the younger people that have to deal with climate change, and it's easy to get drowned in negativity coming out of the pandemic. Indy is talking about the massive scale of change, and everybody else talking about the scale of change that needs to happen. It's easy to feel nihilist about it and feel this despair. I just wanted to hear from the speakers the case for optimism in the work that you're doing, and why you think the work that you're doing can be sufficient and in time enough to make the changes that are necessary.
Okay, so what I'd suggest, thanks for that invitation, Karosh. I suggest that maybe we speak to that in a last round at the end, for all of us speakers to say something about that. What is the case for deep hope, looking forward, optimism, etc., and agency? But first, Kofi, would you like to respond to the question from Peter? I think was his name in the audience, please.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I am a bit sheepish about answering because we have some distinguished panelists that haven't had a chance to really speak yet, but I will say briefly that that's a real concern, particularly the resurgence of a lot of rhetoric and policies and actions in our country in the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump. That's a very real concern, is the backlash that always occurs in the wake of progress, particularly with Indigenous and Black communities in our country. So it's a real concern. Maybe tying it to just briefly the note on optimism is the incredible resilience demonstrated and adaptability demonstrated by grassroots groups across the spectrum. And so the ability to navigate, move, and weave is not even a 21st century problem. It's something that in particular Black and Indigenous people have been having to deal with since first contact with European colonial communities. And so in not trying to offer a technical answer specific to that question, but an investment in the faith of people who've had to navigate these structures for so long, that they will again.
Thank you for that. And this relates a little bit to the land back movement. Just before we come to the question in the chat, Pam or Jonathan, would you like to respond at all to that notion? Because this also relates to, as I said, land back movement, our concept of ownership of land and of reconceiving our relationship with land.
I'll jump in. You know, fear is a motivator for those that are scared of change. And, you know, when we start talking land back, and it's not about physically giving something back, it's about taking ownership and taking a role in our responsibility to look after those lands. And, you know, I've had this conversation so many times as an Indigenous woman. You know, my people were caretakers for over 13,000 years of the lands and territories here in Nova Scotia and Yungaling. It is about a relationship of our responsibilities to our lands. And when I say lands, you know, I often refer to Insit Nogama, which is all my relations. And quite often people think that all of my relations are those physical beings, my aunties, my uncles, my grandparents. But it's so much more. It's my relationship to the land, the water, to the sea, to the, you know, it's the environment that I am, that is my ancestors. And it is about doing things differently, and it is about taking responsibility. Nobody should own the lands. These lands were gifted to us as individuals to look after. They weren't gifted to us to take and control and continually pull out resources. You know, you can only take so much out without giving back. So, you know, for me, and my piece on this is fear is a motivator for people who are scared of change. So it would be up to us as grassroots movements to really talk about the education of what our responsibility is and what we mean by that. If people actually talked about these things in a different way, I think we can shift those fears to more of an understanding. And you know, Indy has said, you know, we are at a very crucial moment. We don't have generations to fix some of this stuff. We have to push now, and we have to do things differently now. So, and I'm just going to leave it at that, because I'm sure Jonathan has a piece that he would love to add to this as well.
Yeah, what comes to mind is at the intersection maybe of a few things that were said. You know, there's a person in the room that was talking about, you know, science fiction, and you know, there's so many corporations and armies that are hiring science fiction writers to better get a sense of the future. And probably that if, you know, if we need a war type scale effort to face some of the challenges we have, we'll need to have some very solid imagination infrastructure collectively to visualize and sense the kind of futures we might want to work towards. So that might be something to look into. And in terms of the scale, you know, cathedral used to be built across generations, and each generation had a part to contribute to. And if I look just within my own life, you know, I'm from the suburbs. I would mow my lawn, my dad's lawn, with a tractor, and then look away and look at how straight the lines were. And that was an idea of success at that point. And Nouveau Voisin, which was founded to challenge that, has like now 7 requests per day, 2-year waiting list. We're working on a national campaign with the David Suzuki Foundation to address some of the financial, regulatory, supply market around all this. And there's clearly a lot of different actors contributing to that at the same time. So, and that's only in the span of like, you know, 2 decades perhaps. So I think the future can be difficult to predict, and that can be a source of anxiety, but the change can be surprisingly fast and good also. So the unknown aspects of the future can be a source of anxiety, but also a source of surprise and hope.
Lovely. Thank you so much for those comments, Pam and Jonathan. We are on borrowed time, but I'm conscious there's one question on on borrowed time in many ways. But can you comment on the effect that more space is being made for non-Christian spiritual public practices like smudging or Muslim prayer rooms has had on public life? Especially considering how secular we consider our North American society to be. I will give a quick answer to that, and if anyone else would like to intervene, you can. As I said in my opening remarks, our emphasis very much is on spirituality, not religion, specifically, first of all. And a spirituality that needs everyday expression in cities, whatever spirituality means to you, especially in the sense of connection between people, a shared sense of connection, a shared sense of connection with nature, and what that can mean. And yes, there are all kinds. If we open up, this would be a whole another whole session to address this question properly. I wonder if before we go into a final round of just a final statement from each person, is there anyone on the panel who would like to respond to this question? Okay. All right, I think we'll leave it there then. And I'll invite now a final statement from everyone, and I'll go last. Just a final either reflection, or you can respond to the invitation of Krosh, something that gives you deep hope and optimism for moving forward at the scale of change that we're talking about here. Let's see. We'll go in order of my screen. How about, which is Jennie, Kofi, Jonathan, Pam, Indy, and then I'll close. Jennie.
Thank you. I would just say that collective resistance, collective action, grassroots engagement in intersectional perspectives on all of the challenges and opportunities ahead is such fulfilling work, and all of us in this space get to collaborate with amazing people doing inspiring things. So I would say that is my note of optimism, is to encourage us all to continue relationship building, collaboration, collective action, and solidarity. Thank you.
Thanks. Kofi.
Yeah, I want to echo what Jennie said. I also say thank you to everybody, but in the face of these insurmountable issues, or what appear to be insurmountable, there's always moments of innovation. You almost can't predict when some of those might happen. And so joining in community with people that share your passion, your interests, your values, and building those coalitions seem critical. And so I'm glad that this book and this conversation has helped point that way.
Thanks so much. And Jonathan.
I was on mute. Merci, everyone. I think this conversation is giving me hope. And I knew Pam from Halifax, and I'm really happy that I'm meeting more people who are contributing to that part of the land, and looking forward to what can emerge from these conversations also.
Merci. Pam.
That's a big question, by the way. Hope, for me, it's seeing our youth really begin to engage and work with our elders, our knowledge keepers, and how that is transferring to movements, especially grassroots movements, to help educate and bring people together and bring awareness. And I think that for me is the biggest hope, is that we've been able to bring awareness to so much. And I think we do have challenges ahead of us. And yet, we are moving forward. And we, Indigenous people are resilient, and we will be here, and we'll continue to be here. So, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Pam. And Indy.
I suppose my two things. One, I don't think we have a choice. I don't think there's a convenient, nice fallback to villagehood, and we all live locally, and the world will be okay. If we mess this up, I think we probably don't survive as a civilization. And there's loads of game theoretic reasons for that. So I think one of the key things to remember is I don't think there is this remarkable, beautiful, nice return to a kind of a mythical 15th century. I think we're locked into a new future, and we're going to have to embrace that. So, and that's going to have to be at planetary scale. I think that's a deep challenge for all of us. And there's loads of good reasons, whether it's kind of, or reasons for why there is no kind of gentle retreat into history. I think the second thing is that I think we are going to have to embrace, the reason why I talk about the scale is because a scale is an invitation for us to be much bigger people. And I think we have to embrace a bigness about us, that in history, there have been moments of extraordinary capability and extraordinary transformations, and we have to embrace that reality. So I invoke the scale of the challenge in order to invite us to be bigger and to be able to imagine the scope of what this transition looks like. And I think that's what we have to embrace. So I don't think there's a gentle retreat from this transition possible. I think there's an invitation to be what we need to be. And that's what our generation is asked for. This is not a crisis for our kids, it's our crisis right now. There will be no future unless we deal with it, everyone in this room. And I think we have to start to embrace the reality of the scale of what we're talking about. And that's an invitation, not a thesis of fair.
Thank you for that, Indy. And for me, 7 Generation Cities is really about an invitation, not just to civic solidarity, but to civic and planetary solidarity. So it's an invitation for us to cultivate the strength, the wisdom, the imagination, the courage, the love to build cities that are worthy of us all, of our ancestors, of future ancestors, for 7 generations and more. And, for Deep Hope, it's about starting where you are, doing what you can, and remember that those of us alive now were born at just the right time to help change everything. So I thank you to the panelists. Thanks to everyone for being here virtually and in the room on this day of mourning and also of deep hope. Thank you.